Mandelbrot to a breakthrough. In 1980, he created an equation of his own, one that combined all of the Julius sets into a single image. When Mandelbrot iterated his equation, he got his own set of numbers. Graphed on a computer, it was a kind of roadmap of all the Julius sets, and quickly became famous as the emblem of fractal geometry. The Mandelbrot set.
It's not easy to describe the Mandelbrot set visually. It looks like a man, it looks like a cat, it looks like a cactus, it looks like a cockroach. It's got little bits and pieces that remind us of almost anything that you can see out in the real world, particularly living things. So it has a character that reminds us of a lot of things, and yet it itself is unique and new.
The Mandelbrot set is real, an absolute thing, no question whatsoever. Any mathematician or any computer scientist or student in a school can study it and find the same, describe the same thing. It's a common experience. And so such things that can be magnified forever and have infinite precision do exist, but they're not touchable.
It's a geometrical shape, an icon, if you wish, which somehow embodies as an example a very important aspect of how the world works. Somebody recently actually called this set the thumbprint of God.
With this mysterious image, Mandelbrot was issuing a bold challenge to long-standing ideas about the limits of mathematics.
The blinders came off, and people could see forms that were always there, but formerly were invisible.
The Mandelbrot set was a great example of what you could do in fractal geometry, just as the archetypical example of classical geometry is the circle.
When you zoom in, you see them coming up again, so you see self-similarity. You see, by zooming in, you zoom, you're zooming in, and pop. Suddenly, it seems like you're exactly where you were before, but you're not. It's just that way down there, it has the same kind of structure as way up here, and the sameness can be grokked.
Now we'll begin our serious exploration of the Mandelbrot set. A voyage which, in fact, could last forever and ever, much longer than the lifetime of the universe. I have here the full set, about 6 inches across. Now, if I blow this up, I'll increase the magnification now 13 times, and you see more and more detail is appearing. And the interesting thing is you see mini Mandelbrots, replicas, almost identical, yet perhaps subtly different, of the original set. And I can go on doing this. Here's a magnification of more than 3,000 times. So the original picture, about 6 inches across, is now half a mile across. And no matter how much we magnified it, a million times, a billion times, until the original set was bigger than the entire universe, we would still see new patterns, new images emerging, because the frontier, the M set, is infinitely complex. And when I say infinitely, I really mean that. Most people, when they say infinitely, they mean only rather big. This is really infinite. is so remarkable, in fact, astounding about the Mandelbrot set is that although it's infinitely complex, it's based on incredibly simple principles, unlike almost everything in modern mathematics. In fact, anybody who can add and multiply can understand the principles on which it's based. You don't even have to subtract or divide, still less use logarithms or trigonometrical functions to comprehend how the Mandelbrot set is created. In fact, in principle, it could have been discovered any time in human history and not merely in 1980. But the problem is this: although it's only based on adding and multiplying, you have to carry out those operations millions, billions of times to create a complete set. And that's why it was not discovered until the era of modern computers.
All right, shalom, shalom, family. I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer, and then we're going to start diving in. We're going to be looking at some interesting connections. As you know, I like to always throw in something creative. Today, we're going to be using pottery, and we're also going to be looking at genetics. It's going to be an interesting live, I think. So I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from the evil. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Amen, amen. So I first want to make a statement real fast. Let me actually make this statement. So if you notice something interesting in the world that we're living in, we're starting to see something interesting develop with genetics. We're seeing a genetic Adam. We're seeing a genetic Eve. We're seeing that all humans are connected. We're seeing that every single person in the world, whether they be in America or in Japan or here or there, all connect to one source. But the interesting thing is that the world wants you to believe that that source will be in Africa. But what I want to show you today, if we follow one specific lineage, we can find out that all humans in the whole world has split from the place where Noah had left, which would be about in the area of the Levant. And then everyone diversified from there. So let's take a quick little dive into something. First, I need to open something. I need to go to a tree. I think the best way to understand the true origins is finding the evidence of the true roots of a very controversial lineage that seems to get a lot of slack. And it has to be this D&E group. This D&E group, when looked at more and more closer, more and more geneticists are concluding that parts of this group is not going to be native to African. In fact, look at this little map here. What we're looking at here is a major example of the D group. Now, if we take a quick look at this, we can note that the largest portion of this group is in Japan. Now, what's interesting about this group, if we go through its scientific divides, because as we're always going to be putting this in the biblical understanding, but we're also going to be looking at it how the scientific divides work. So they talk about some of the roots to basically some of the East Asian Paleolithic roots to some East Asian lineages. And I just talk about this all the time, that F-M89 makes GHIJK, it makes HIJK, it makes IJK, which from IJK, you get your IJ groups and your KM9s, where you're going to get your K1, where you get your LTs from, and your K2s, where you get your MNOPQRSTV. Why is that important? Because we're going to have to look at that O, because the movements of O shadow the movements of D, but one is older than the other, and that's going to be the D group that's older. But there's another group that moves faster and sooner than the D group, which is the C group. We'll talk about this as we go over this. So it just talks about some of the C groups that were in the Asian area. That's very important. I'm just going to go down to the DE groups. So it talks about the DE groups. Just talks about when they would be about, right, these things, right, are estimates because the fact that we have them there. We have the SNPs, and we'll go over that real fast. It's just talking about these SNPs, for example. Let me go back and just show it, right? So the Y tree is using SNPs and giving basically what you get from modern people to basically what you see today. Now, what's interesting, what we see is that some of the D lineages actually branch in Yemen. Now, I find that really interesting because this is usually a Japanese or Chinese group, a group that's usually in Japan, China, around that area. Areas from islands off of India, and we find some in Yemen. Now, that's fairly interesting. So we're going to kind of go a little more deeper into the roots of it. But let's look a little bit at what it says here with D. As with F and C, all levels between D and D1b are not really significant, right? In other words, Japanese D1b is not necessarily significant, more closely related population-wise to basically the Tibetan or certain continent areas. The reason why that's important because the earlier people in these continents, obviously there was a massive wipeout of ancient Neanderthals and all that stuff. So we know that these groups come in a little later. This is also what they call modern humans. Scientifically, you'll see the term used as modern humans. So when we see these haplogroups, like your F and your C's and your D's, all those are all going to be considered modern humans. That's just important to understand. So it's just going to be talking about certain groups. Long story short, the ones we want to look at is this O, this C, and this D. It's very important. So it's going to obviously have links to its ancient origin. And we're going to get a good look at what is its ancient origins. So first, let's take a quick little dive in some deep dive in history first before we start diving into the story of this D group. Let's take a quick dive into it.
The very first human habitation in the Japanese archipelago has been traced to Paleolithic period around 35,000 BC. Dental structures belong to the Sundaland group, mainly distributed in ancient populations of Southeast Asia. The period of Japanese prehistory that spans from about 12,000 BC to about 1000 BC is known as the Jomon period. In this time, Japan was inhabited by a hunter-gatherer culture that reached a considerable degree of sedentism and cultural complexity. The name Jomon is the Japanese translation for cord-marked pottery, which was typical for that time. The pottery style characteristic of the first presses of Jomon culture was decorated by impressing cords into the surface of wet clay.
All right, so this is very important. This pottery that was a main pottery in Japan with a certain group that we're going to look into, right? They're going to be Jomon culture. We're going to look into that group. That's an ancient group that is replaced by a group that comes in that has an O group. But the first group has C, then a D group comes in, which is Oman, and then your O groups come in. That's going to be very important as we go over these things. Now, why am I showing you this pottery? Now, take an interesting look at this pottery. What it is basically if you look carefully, this is a pottery that is going to be a certain style that is going to be taking basically raw material and then basically pressing something on it, right? You can have seashells or different lines that you press on it to kind of make that design, right? You can see it would be designed with other materials, seashells, stones, plant fibers, and all types of different things. But what they would have is this interesting lines, this line style. They call it corded, marked. There is another culture that has this same style, right? The same style that I was just showing you, and is in an interesting place. Let me show you real fast. So it actually is going to be called the corded or cord impressed instead of cord marked, cord impressed pottery from the late Neolithic northern Levant. Now, the northern Levant, this is going to be in the area of Syria, right? Sure. So let's get an interesting look at this real fast because this actually is kind of interesting. Let me actually go back over here and open this so that we can get a more interesting, detailed look on this. So just going to talk about the cord and press pottery, right? All the way in late Neolithic, northern Levant. So now we're looking at Syria. Now, why are we looking at Syria? Because Syria obviously is going to have some very important connections to the early biblical narrative. We should expect people to be around Syria fairly early. But what's interesting is that it has this very interesting culture, right? It has a very interesting culture around it. This very interesting pottery. Now, if you take a look at this pottery and you take a look at this pottery matches this pottery. Now, why is that important? Because this pottery is found with a certain group of individuals that we have to have a conversation on real fast. We're going to see this pottery pop out about the time of the Jomon individuals. Why is that important? When we start linking the genetics and finding out the movement of these things, it is going to make a clear picture to what actually is going on, where they come from, where they go, right? So we're going to keep an eye on this pottery that we have here because we're going to get a good understanding on what's going on here. So we're going to get a good understanding on this pottery. Now, just for a quick insight, we actually know that there are D groups, because this is what we're going to be looking at, is this D group, but there is a certain understanding of the D group before I go to this, to be actually mention that real fast. All right. So this is going to be from a genetic paper we're going to look at. We're going to be basically getting an understanding of the D group. I'm just going to read a quick highlight from something. If you've seen, there were previous studies on the D group. Previous studies in population genetics have proposed, right, that the Y chromosomal, right, Y DNA haplogroup D ancestor likely originated from Africa. Now, you've probably seen that. They had a study in 2019, just recently, they was talking about it. But then a new study came out because what they were trying to do, let me actually explain it real fast. What they were trying to do is that they found modern people, not ancient people, but they found 3 modern Nigerians, and they were haplogroup D. So you see haplogroup D here, and they found out that they were D0. D0, as you can see right here, this is D0. D0 is not DE, but D0 is a split from the D group that basically would actually be D2, right? A brother of D1. So they actually found a branch of modern people and concluded that that group must have always been in Africa because we found modern people. Well, we obviously have to look at fossils to truly find origin and not conclude it based on modern people, but conclude it based on what we actually find, right? And that's how we actually would know. For example, the reason why I say that is because if we understand some of the importance of the structure of things, let me just zoom in here. I want to show you something here. All right. So all that you see on here that's yellow is going to be the D group, right? All right. So before I start clicking on this, let me make sure I point this out on here. All right, so this is what's important about this study that I'm going to show you from this thing. All right, and it's going to be about the DE group, but mainly D. So obviously, I'm going to bring you some new information. So this is just from 2001, right? So last year, December, right? 2001, right? The last month of the last year. So a genetic variation in the Y chromosome among modern Japanese males related to several logic and physiological characteristics, right? Now, why is it important? Why is this important? Because this study, right, it just talks about how they had previous studies, but this is a new study on a lot of certain connections of groups. I'm just going to read a highlight from it real fast. That's from this real fast before we even start getting a little more deeper in it. It says the haplogroup D branch, right, next started out of Africa migration, rapidly expanded across Eurasia, and later diversified in East Asia, right? It just talks about, obviously, the branch of D-N55 is one of the branches of D is only found in modern Japanese males. So that's important that we only find them there. This certain SNP, we only find that DM55 in Japanese males. Why is that important? We're going to kind of get a little understanding of the way that Japan looked. Now, if you already seen Japan, let me just show something so that I can consciously build your mind on how Japan changed. Right? If you know, Japan always is flooding, right? Let me show you something here. Let me see if I can show you Japan. So Japan, it looks like a little island, but actually Japan long ago used to be, this little area used to be connected. This little area used to be connected here. Let me actually show it from this, just to kind of make it clear. Right here, we're gonna get a little illustration of it. Right here. As you can see,
during much of this period, Japan was connected to the Asian continent by land bridges due to lower sea levels, via Sakhalin Island in the north and via the Ryukyu Islands and Taiwan in.
All right, just I'm gonna make sure my sound is on. Okay. All right, so let's look a little closer at this. So why am I showing you that? Notice the way. Remember, I was showing just recently about paleo channels, right? The way that water changes, or what used to be there. Now, this is a little different than that. This is just showing the results of change of mass that isolates a population and causes a isolated genetic diversity. And that's what we're going to see today, is that the Most High was working when he sent the people out into the world, and some went into certain places and some got separated in certain places, and they developed a genetic diversity. So that's what we're going to see here, is that this little area that was an area that people can walk into became separate later on. As we see with the maps nowadays of Japan, we can see that Japan is like obviously a separated area than what we would expect it, how it looked back then. Right. It doesn't look like how it looked back then today. Right. So it's a massive difference. You got to keep that in mind as we go over this, that it would have been easier for people to travel into certain areas in time. So let's look a little more deeper into it. So let's get into this piece right here. So remember how we was just reading on that, how we talk about that it's only found in Japanese men. And we know that the haplogroup D migrated from the Eurasian continent, right? It's going to go down a little bit. It talks about some other interesting things, but I'm going to read you this highlight from that page. Y-DNA haplogroup D-M55, one of the branches of haplogroup D, is only found in modern Japanese males, suggesting that individuals with Y-DNA haplogroup D migrated from the Eurasian continent. Now, it tells you that this group seems like it must have migrated from the Eurasian continent. Now, again, we're going to be connecting these different corded ware cultures that, again, remember, we found this in the land of Syria. So we're going to be looking to see if this lineage could have split from the land of Syria, right? And if we look at ancient fossils right away, we can already see if we had a group over here, and we was talking about this before, that we had different papers that would mention that the DE group must have split in this area. So this little coverage right here, low coverage, but we still know that this will be a Yap lineage. It could be a D group. Most likely this would be a D group. This was probably the one from Syria. This group probably split, and we can see that it has some areas over here. So we see a D group over here. So that's a still long time ago, right? And then we see that we have a D group right here, right? So we have a split. We have evidence that it could have been a split, and then it could have went over here and here. And then we know without a doubt that the Japanese group had went through these areas, right? So we're going to get a good understanding of that. So this is very ancient over there, right? You can see the years before present as at least 2000 BC. So you can see, obviously, it's diversifying over there, right? Having a lot of different SNPs, but we can get the isolated area. So we can see right here, just like how we've seen before, they can enter in, right? Because these areas were once connected. And there we can see a really ancient D group. And there it is, Jomon, right? We was just looking at that, the Jomon group. So that's going to be a D group. We also get some over here. So again, Jomon over here. We could get a much older group of Jomon. So that's very, very old of that Jomon group. So very, very ancient. We can see right there. Right. It's another one very ancient. That's that D-M55. Right. Just let you know that there's a couple of them there. So we have an isolated lineage that went in this area and basically spread and diversified in a lot of these different areas. It's also over here. You can see in this little area. So obviously having a lot. So what we would actually see is that from this area here, we would see it split, a D group split, kind of go this way and make its way back over here and then twist through this area. But it goes here very soon, very fast. How fast? That when we're putting it on the outer Africa scale, it's tipping the scales. That is showing that if we connect that to an E group, it kind of writes its own narrative, right? It kind of writes its own narrative. What I mean by that? Let's go a little more deeper into it because we got to look at the pieces very carefully. So remember, they enter in, they dwell there, they're isolated, they're separated, and they develop as their own lineage, right? They become their own group. We even get understanding with the pottery, right? The pottery is identical, right? The pottery that we see there that we can take a quick look at, right? That pottery right there with those lines and everything and the different cross sections is the same thing we see on these, right? If we look carefully, we can see the same thing. It's cross sections, lines. This is the same thing. Marked ware pottery versus imprinted ware, right? Or cord ware or cord marked pottery, right? Just to get a good understanding of it. And even the D group that I was just showing you, this group, their name is named off of that pottery. This group right here, that name is named off of this pottery, right? That's what makes it important, is that this pottery is with a certain group of the Jomon. As you can see right here in Japan, the Jomon period is named after its corded marked pottery. So you can see what's going on there. And the term Jomon was coined. You can see obviously a different individual had named them that, right? So this group is named because of that pottery and it's connecting that pottery there. We also can see a connection with the genetics as well, kind of stretching from the areas of Syria with the same style of pottery that would have been around that area. So we kind of got a connection, and it would be also ancient. So this is Neolithic time frame. So we can get a good understanding of a possible ancient migration from the areas of the Levant to areas of Japan, right? But we got to go a little more deeper of it to get a good understanding of what's going on here, right? Why is that important? Because this D group is actually older than the E group. The D group that I'm actually showing you here, we had talked about before, is that it's older than the E group. And why is that important? Because it'll show us ancient human origin and migrations, right? Because that's going to give us a good understanding of what's going on there, right? Because we had talked about that. We can see with some other different pieces. I'm just going to read a few up here. I'm going to go up a little bit and kind of point out something. As always, remember these dates are usually exaggerated, but again, even using the exaggeration, we can kind of make the point of the origins of migration of these groups, just to get a good understanding of these things. Let me see which one I want to point out here. This one is okay. So watch what it says here. So it just talks about the Ainu. We're going to talk about the Ainu because this group is going to be an earlier group. The Jomon group is earlier than the Ainu, but they have the same lineages. Genetic testing has shown that the Ainu, belonging mainly to Y DNA haplogroup M or D-M55, which is D1A2, and note what also is in that group, the C group, right? We're going to talk about that because the C group was there older than the D group, but the O group comes there and pushes a lot of these groups around. But you're going to see that these three groups with other groups are going to be in that area very early. Y DNA haplogroup D is found throughout the Japanese. I was just talking about a little area, right, that we was just talking about, but with high frequencies among the Ainu, right, and all that far from north, right, and we just seen from what island, right? We can see right here from this little island. So this is the island right here. I don't know how you say that, Raku, right? There's little islands down here. So it's letting you know about the Ainu and their origins and everything. So obviously, and to be lesser extent among those islands and everything. So we're seeing that from the north, we would have more likeliness that the people of the Ainu had to come from the north downwards into this area, right? And again, if we look at this little design, we can see that they do stretch pretty high up. And we could imagine that D group coming down from these areas when it was all one piece, that the D group would have stretched in from these areas and then was isolated, closed in on that area, and then started to increase and become very diverse. So, and we can see obviously it stretches over here. So if we was to link these all and make it one color, we can see that that group would come out like that. Just like what we seen when we took the whole picture of the D group and we kind of put it on a map. But obviously this is going to be from modern people, but we're going to be looking at the ancient. So you can see they would have diversed from here, and they want to kind of went out, as you can see, to these areas as well, and then went to here and mainly developed in this area, right? So they have reached out and reached some of these areas, but we know it diverse here because we get a residue a little bit over here for all that. So that's very important that we get in a major connection there to see how these things were going. But let's go on and read a little more what it's saying. Recently, it was confirmed that the Japanese branch of Haplogroup D M55 is distinct and isolated. Remember how we talked about that, how that island was separated and it became an isolated lineage. So M is going to be DM55 that we're going to look at, and isolated from other D branches for more than 53,000 years ago. Now, there is no D group, whether we take it out of Africa scale or fossils or whatnot, that is older than this D. So that means that this D group was found in Japan before we even get E groups in Africa. Why is this important? Because it changes what is understood about an Africa idea, out of Africa concept. If we notice which one's older and where do they develop in their isolate location. So we're going to get a good understanding of this group and its locational boundaries. So we're going to get a good understanding of it. And it also brings other lineages into this. So, okay, so suggesting that D originated somewhere in Central Asia. So obviously looking at the fossils, many different studies are concluding that D had originated in Central Asia, right? Just so it's going to get a good understanding of those things. So we can get some of the D groups that were in these areas in certain mountains. I already talked about this little island. I might as well show it. I don't know why we don't have a map open, because we definitely will need a map, as always, when going over these things. And if anyone has any questions or statements, it always is good. If you know anything about these D groups, definitely throw them out. Our beloved brother, Ahaya, how you say that? Be praised. Amen. Ahaya be praised. The D strand found in Nigeria was found to be very young versions of D. That's right. Absolutely. The D haplogroup found in Syria. And that's right. It's found in Syria, Arabia, and America. That's absolutely right. Was found to be far older than the DY DNA found in Niger. Yep. And that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And that's why touching this is going to bring clarity. So what he was just talking about is those D groups that in 2019, they were kind of using those modern Ds to conclude that E groups had to be African. But even using the D like that is not understanding the mutations of those D groups. So looking at that D group, we're not looking at DE. We're looking at a split, not even from the root of D, but we're looking at a split of a split. That's important because that D0 is actually D2, not D1, and not the ultimate root of D, which is root D or DCT. You can see right there, DCT. That's important to know that to use this and say that because we found one SNP of D African, that makes all this group African. That wouldn't be feasible. But we should take the ancient SNP and see if we can find where that one's at. And if we can't, we can start locating where its SNPs are. It's by the fossils. And that will give us a good understanding of those things. And that's also what we're looking at today. Get a good understanding of those SNPs. Speaking of which, let's quickly look at some found locations of the diverse lineages that come from CT. So from CT, we know what comes from CT, CF, and DE. Now, from CT, as you can see from the areas of Jordan, it splits, continues in the lands of Israel. We know that the DE group ends up going to the lands of Turkey. Now, that's why we were looking at this, because that one right there, that's about, these ones over here, that's about 7,000 years before present. We also know that it had to go into the areas of Turkey right here, right? At least about that time frame. So that's what most likely this one is right here. Most likely this one is going to be that one that actually goes into the areas of Turkey, right? So right here, we can see some of the DE group right there. That one is the one that we were just looking at that goes into the areas of Turkey, right? We were just looking at that one on the paper, right? I just want to also confirm to you that what that paper that I'm showing you is actual fossils. And I already showed how we can also find these sheets and everything, but this is just a faster way to go about it and look at it. So we know that we had a split of this DE group about the area of Turkey. Now, we also know that geneticists also confirmed that DE does split in the areas of Turkey. For example, when they did a breakdown of how humans are connected, geneticists have brought out some very important information that we need to know about. He brought out a paper called Reconstruction of Outer Africa Concept Not Having Enough Proof. What he wrote is this. He wrote, the Middle Eastern haplogroups, D and E split 42,000 years ago. Now, I already had talked about this before. Let me just show you what I mean when I talk about this. There's going to be different, what's the word I'm looking for? There's going to be different numbers for the same fossil, right? For example, there's a fossil that's found of a L3 that's found in Tel Halula that we were talking about. And there's a difference in what they say how old it is, right? You'll probably see this fossil. Let me just point it out real fast, right? So Tel Halula, why is this important? Because Tel Halula, if you look at the fossil, right? Because notice that this one would be a early DE, one not that turns to D and all that, and we see other places where they say it must have split in that area. But now let's take a quick look at something on here real fast. Let me see right here. Let me just point to something and show you something. So you can see right here when it talks about this lineage here, I'm just going to click it and just point something out here. So you can see right here an ancient DNA analysis of a 8,000 BC find. Now, what's interesting about that same 8,000 BC, now by fossils is 8,000 BC. But that same fossil, when it's put to the outer Africa scale, right? When you scale it, I had talked about this before, that it raises the age a lot. It raises the age a lot. Let me I'll just type it down and show you real fast, because it's really easy to find because it was a major find. Here, I'll just go to mtDNA. Oh, not so random. All right, shouldn't be too hard, I'm thinking. Otherwise, I know how to find it. The best way to find it is like this. They found out that it has connections to, early DE groups. So they put another origin right here for that L3 carrier. I'll just point it out real fast just to show you. Watch what it says about this lineage here, about L3. So we can see that it will talk about L3 has a back migration to Africa from Asia 70,000 years ago, because that area in Syria, right? And this one that is talking about here is actually talking about that same fossil. We had did a big live on it before that we was talking about that the fossil that was found in Tel Halula is 8,000 years ago in fossils, but when you put it on the outer Africa scale, which is counting mutations and all that, That's what the out of Africa scale is. It's a difference between dating what time frame was found in the culture versus throwing it on the out of Africa scale, right? Which is usually dating, just like you see right here. This is using the out of Africa scale. This is using the ages of those splits and everything. But again, that's what we found out when we looked at this L3, is that this L3, the same age as that 8001, this L3 is that same L3, just to kind of make that clear on that. So sometimes you'll have that with fossils. So I just want to point that out real fast before we continue on, because it's going to kind of bring the pieces together when we put these pieces together. So let me just go down to one of these little pieces just to have a quick influence. I'll just leave that there. We don't need it right now. All right. So again, back to this. Why are we connecting these two? So that we know that these two are the same ages, about the same ages. So this one and the one all the way over here in the areas of Japan are about the same age. So it's very important. So they split and they diversify and they settle in certain places. So it's going to be very important as we go over this. We can see that the D also goes into other different areas, the area of the Mongols and obviously around different areas of China, all around. And just went a little too low. But this is what's important, because, you know, when we get a good understanding of where D goes, Japan, obviously, right? Just to get a good understanding of it. So Japan, Russia, different areas of Japan. So we obviously know we have fossils of it in these certain areas, because these are going to be fossils. These are going to be actual fossils, right? Just to click one just to show, right? And then note the mtDNA. We're going to connect it also by understanding that its movements also show that it had an early origin. There it is, Jomon, right? The Jomon culture. And note the mtDNA. Let me just open up this little thing. One of the brothers has shared some paper with an mtDNA flyer. I thought it was interesting because it goes over the mtDNA of the Ainu. Because remember, the Jomon, we're gonna go over it. The Jomon and the Ainu are related. They're gonna be highly related, and we're gonna kind of go over that. We can see right here. Watch what it says here about the lineages. This is gonna be from this paper. All right. It's going to be from human genetic diversities in Japanese, right? In that little island area, dual structure and beyond. So we're going to get a little understanding of the group. I'm going to close this real fast and just read something from this thing right here. I might as well go to it right on the PDF. I have to recopy how that will open, which is right here. All right. All right. So watch what it says here about this lineage. The Jomon period from 16,000 or that's 16,000, right? 16,000 KYA. So that's important. 16 to 3 KYA, which is 1,000 years ago, takes its name from the cord marked pottery, typically found in the time period. So we already talked about that. Maybe we was connecting those two cultures again. So remember that cord marked pottery obviously has the same types of designs all the way in the land of the Levant, which they call the cord impressed pottery. So cord marked, cord impressed, right? Cord marked, cord impressed. Same pottery, right? Same style of pottery. Very, very important. But again, let's continue on. So we got a good understanding of the Jomon and everything. Let's go a little more into it real fast. Just talks about obviously the people that were found there and everything. Let me actually put a little more on that search because I think this thing copied all weird. But this is basically what I wanted to read. Just talk about who they are and everything. And just talk about how they lived, right? They were hunter-gatherers and everything. They were obviously a people that was spread throughout that whole area, and they obviously have human remains. So these are fossils. They know that they have fossils of these individuals. That's what's important about this, is that they have fossils of these individuals to kind of give us the understanding that these are going to be real individuals, right? But let's go a little more into it because it's going to be kind of deep, but kind of understandable. Now it says the Ainu and the, probably say this name weird, Raikuan population are indigenous. Now this is what we need to see. You see this word right here? That is important because remember, it told us about how one group became an isolate group. Now, to be indigenous means that they are one with the land. That means that this group would have been early native to Japan, right? So that's going to be very important. Groups who mostly reside in all those different islands, even that one that we was talking about at the bottom, respectfully, because obviously just talk about how they got connections with their head shapes and their skeleton shapes with those of the Jomon. So it lets you know that the Jomon skulls are about the same as even those of the Ainu and those that reside in that Raikuan area. So you can see that the Ainu, we're going to look at the genetics and kind of put that also together. They had some genetic connections with the Aman. So very important. They are thought to be the more direct descendants of the Jomon people than the mainland Japanese. So it's letting you know that the Jomon people have higher connection to the Ainu, and that's going to be important too when we're going over some of the understanding of the ancestry. So it just goes over some of the similarities between those different groups, right? Obviously might be due to a shared ancestry. It is because they're going to have the same male lineage but different female groups that we're going to see there. So you see, obviously, when we talk about those previous studies, what they have found, right, in connection to some of these groups. That's very important. So we're getting connection of obviously the pottery movement, and we're getting the interesting connection of the movement of the peoples. Now, if we also note the movement of the women, right, obviously talking mitochondria, it's going to get a good understanding of these things. So it's this part grabbing the DNA from the mitochondria. It's kind of interesting. So I'm going to kind of show a little bit of it. Now, obviously, getting a good understanding of this chart is not 100% using roots. Like, for example, do we have the fossils of these L's, like, for example, L3, but we know it actually started over here. That L3 actually started over there. So you got to be careful with some of the way that these charts are designed. You want to make sure you look at the sources directly, not just throwing them on a chart, because a lot of it can be based on old conclusions that don't stand to fossils. So that's very important. But here it is. We're looking at some of the mtDNA there, right? It just gives us a good understanding of what's going to be there. And we obviously can get a good understanding when we see these skulls. There's the Oman skulls and everything. And we can get a good understanding that they would talk about which ones will look like which ones and whatnot. So Jomon, you can see what someone would look like who would be Jomon. And then a recent lines. We're going to talk about that, the Mayo, that group that comes in, that kind of has kind of like a Chinese blend in there. So very, very interesting to go over these things. So this is just going to be, showing which lineages went there, right? Now, they're going to be mostly under the M lineages, but you're going to have some N lineages as well. So that's important too. But we do know that there were some L lineages that went that way, that went all the way over there to that far distance. We had talked about that, about the L3 in Mongolia that went over there. So that's something that's also to take note in. But most of the female lineages are Asian lineages or lineages that seem like they will be more around that area. So nothing too shocking, nothing too surprising. It's actually what is expected. So just to kind of make that clear on that one, just for if you want to know a little more on those. So now we're going to go a little bit into that Y DNA on these groups, just to get a more clear understanding of these groups that go there. So obviously this is an ancient group, right? So we're talking about thousands and thousands of years ago, right? Thousands and thousands of years ago. And the Ainu are going to be indigenous, right? The Ainu are going to be indigenous. And the group that we was talking about, the Jomon, are older than the Ainu, and they are 16 to 3,000 years ago. So, and they're in Japan. So that's going to be very important, besides the other mutations. So that's going to be important for understanding origins of these groups. Going to be very important for understanding origins of these groups. All right, so now let's go into a little bit of something that I think I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about this because it's kind of important to know about, what lineages are earlier in the areas of, let's say, in the world. So I'm going to open this up. So we're going to be more focusing on the Y-DNA and everything because it will take too long if we do the MT. We can do the mtDNA another time, but we're going to be looking at Y-DNA. So this is going to be your earliest lineages to say that comes out of Africa. Now, I had talked about this before. If you take the oldest modern humans and plot them, there is almost no modern humans in Africa in ancient times. There's no modern human in ancient times in Africa. That's almost a certain. The earliest groups you'll find is like A and B groups, but that's a given because they are gonna break off from their lines and gonna settle in certain areas. But most of the time, you find a lot of like this. For example, there's A00B. This A, when you see A with 3 zeros, that's Neanderthal. So this is just a Neanderthal, right? So obviously ancient humans before how we know about like the flood and the wiping out would have been those A00 groups. But we're going to be looking at the areas of Asia. But I just want you to get an understanding of these early lineages. So C, right? We know that if you've seen where we broke down the splits of A and B, D and E, and CF groups, we believe that A and B shows connections to the Hamite lineages, but the Yap lineages, which a lot of people, we got to understand how that Yap, that allele works, that Yap insertion works. That DE group is different than A and B groups because that D and E group has that Yap lineage in it. So that's important. That D and E actually comes from CT, which is going to be different than A and B and CF. So A and B, D and E, and then CF groups. That makes everything else. CF makes your J's, your Q's, your R's, whatnot. But CF splits and make a C. So that's an early lineage. That's going to be very, very early because Japheth is the most oldest. You also have your A00. That's going to be other Neanderthals because humans lived alongside ancient humans a long time ago. I talked about this before, that Cain's line could have had the same genetics as Adam line because we do know there is a genetic Adam. Why wouldn't there be a genetic Cain? So that's something that's important to know. They would have had the same genetics. So you can see C's all around, right? That's very important. Earliest lineages would be C's. There is a Denisovan. That right there is a Denisovan. How do we know? Because A0000, A with 4 zeros, is Denisovan. So A with 4 zeros will be your Denisovan. So earliest lineages will be in those areas. So very early lineages will be in the upper areas, one not. So very, very important. So again, a good understanding of these areas. So nothing there yet, right? All around. We mostly got some Neanderthals. We got some Japhanites, some C's, and we got some F groups, which we can see. Let me see if I can point one out on here. Right there. There's an F group. So remember, F makes F-M89 makes your GHIJK. So that's very important because Japheth will be the most oldest. He would be the oldest one. We got to look at other sheets if we want to start finding out where DE starts and A and B. Right. Very, very important. We already talked about that on some other papers, but we're just getting a good understanding of what will be some of the earliest lineages. Okay, now let's go to in the construction of your outer Africa concept. There's always going to be your Mesolithic, Paleolithic, and Neolithic time frames. Paleolithic and all other time frames are usually broken into 3 categories: your upper, your middle, and your late Paleolithic. So here is a middle or upper Paleolithic, and we're going to go in and see what changes have happened here. And this is going to be important when we start to put the pieces together. So obviously, getting a good understanding of the landscapes. Just going to zoom in. Usually on the Paleolithic is, there's a little bit there, not super a lot. Just going to zoom in. on these ones. So you can kind of see some there. Now, I'm going to go and see a different one because this one looks like don't have much information on it. We can look on his little chart, which is right here for the little information for those things. If we want to make it by the age, because we're going to be looking in Japan. That's where we got that's where we got to work at in Japan, just to get a good understanding of that. But we can see that a lot of early lineages would be in the north, very early on. That's going to be very important to kind of take note of. That some of the early lineages, like your Neanderthals and the Denisovans and whatnot, they're obviously going to be up there. And we talked about them being pre-flood, wiped out by the effects during the transition of the Younger Dryas and whatnot. So you can see, obviously, getting a good understanding that there's a lot of lineages up in the north, right? You get this one right here. That is going to be a lineage that makes O's and N's and P's, right? P's make your R's and Q's. So it's in China. You can see that very early lineage up there. Obviously, these are going to be Paleolithic. What you're seeing here, all these going to be Paleolithic. And that's what this little thing was going through, that was going through some of the Paleolithic time frames over here. So very important to get a good understanding of that. I'm going to go to the next time. I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to skip a little ahead to the Mesolithic. So early Mesolithic, just to get a little understanding on this one. So it's going to take a quick look at what's here. All right. So we got a little bit of things going on up here in this upper area. You can see over here, there's some eyes. That's your IJK. Remember I said that? IJK makes your eyes. We was talking about that also on some of the Asian lineages when we talk about how they break to pieces, because that's just a mutation. That's all that it is. So IJK, obviously make your IJ and your eyes and whatnot. So that's just something that's also important when looking at these things. So IJK up there. So anything that's under IJK is one family. Very important. All right. You can see obviously some eyes there. There, the large group, some J's in the area of the Caucasus. That's expected. So we got obviously expected lineages in certain areas, whatnot. Okay, so nothing over here in this area. So Mesolithic, so this is important. We're getting a good understanding of locational areas. So Neolithic is when we start getting the most information, Neolithic time frame. So I'm going to jump to Neolithic time frame right here. All right, so let's take a quick look at the Neolithic. All right. So we got some cultures around, obviously some T's. Now we got, remember those F's that was over here? Those F's had obviously made more children. All these except for G and C are from IJK, but they're all going to be from CF. All that you see here, the C is from CF, but GHIJK makes your G's. And so GHIJK connects all these. So all these are going to be related by GHIJK, everything that you see on the screen, besides the C. That C is going to be that you got to go back one node, which is going to be your CF. So CF makes your F-M89 and a C. And under F-M89 makes your GHIJK, HIJK, IJK, and everything that you see here comes from IJK. That's just important to note that now we got mutations. And notice that we got an E pop up here. So we got an E1B1B. This is Neolithic time frame. He's making his way up here, right? So he's obviously went through a mutation and obviously left its spot where it was first at. So that's important that we notice that we have an E. So that's going to be a split from obviously your D and E groups. So a split in that area. That'll be very important. So let's keep on keeping on. So obviously we had some E's in the Neolithic upper north area. So let's just go a little bit over. So obviously you're gonna have different European lineages. There's some, note those Ks. Those Ks are gonna be some of the lineages that, you know, you're gonna get different lines from it. So we remember K, IJK makes your K groups, right? K has the ability to make a lot of different groups, right? So K makes all these groups pretty much that you see here, besides C, which is, remember, C is the oldest one. We've seen that. Remember, it's that we had an F up there and we had a C. So remember that C is a very old lineage, very, very old. It's going to be in these areas, settling around these areas. It's going to be very important that these early lineages are settled in these areas. So you see right there. Let's kind of get into another outlook of it. Let's go back. Now we're going to go just so we can get to where we're going to start looking at, right? Here's going to be the early Copper Age, right? So Copper Age, right after the Neolithic, which is Neolithic Copper Age, about the same. Now notice something interesting over here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and we got a BT group that's going to be up in this area, this upper area. So notice in the areas of Iran, stretching out to this area, you got a BT over there, right? Obviously, you still got the companies growing on these areas over here. I'm just gonna zoom in. So obviously, you got your Indo-European lineages developing over here. That's all right. So they're over there developing, right? You got that E that has stretched. It went all the way over here. So it's adventuring, is reaching some land and stuff. That's important to note. We're gonna go all the way to over here. So obviously the Indo-Europeans lines over here. And we'll go over here. All right, so again, this little area where you have some of the Indo-Europeans, you got some of that BT there. So we have some interesting lines reaching far out. That's kind of reaching this area. Now, if you notice something, not every chart or every person that charts is going to have every haplogroup. He doesn't really have much that's over here or much D's or things like that. That's because it's very complex when you're going over things like D. To plot it down with it, you have to do a focus area, focusing on this area. You got to do a complete focus on this area over here and basically plot them down. And that's why we had that separate sheet right here with a lot of those D fossils already here, just to get kind of an idea of the time frames that is moving throughout these areas. And you can see obviously E's are going to be reaching there. So E, V30, or V22. So obviously they have some reach. When they obviously go through their mutations, they're spreading out and they're going all the way to different areas over here. So that's going to be very important. Very, very important. So now let's get a good understanding of these things. So obviously these areas, there will be different lineages spreading throughout these areas as we go over these things. So that's not surprising to know that they went to different areas very quickly. They went to different areas very quickly. But we know which ones are those main groups like F and C that become major groups and their own groups in a way. So that's just important. That's important as we continue on. So notice again, the Ainu, which even as earlier Jomon groups were already in the areas of Japan, right? And that's Paleolithic time frame. And then the Ainu obviously is considered indigenous to that area. So we didn't really have much D's around besides in certain areas, but they're all in the north. Going to be all in the north area. That's going to be very important to kind of take a good understanding of that. So that's why we had talked about that it is suggested that the individuals with Y DNA haplogroup D migrated from the Eurasian continent. Let me just check the sound section, make sure the sound is okay. All right, so that's fairly interesting just to take a look at that we're seeing that group go into different areas. Now we can also get a little more into this. Let's get a little more deeper into it to get a good understanding of it. But before I show this, let me actually, so you see this little video we was talking about how we know that this area was able to be walked through. We know it changed, right? When we talk about that, we know that it had changed over time, right? And making a genetic separation. You can see in the green right there, the D groups. And notice how massive they are. So up here is more of that D group, but they're still here. And they're not a lot of them over here. They're more over here. So they must have was separated during the isolation of Japan when the areas were separated, because you got a major group in this area of that D group nowadays. So that's kind of important when taking a little note of. Now, continuing on, we can note, obviously, is very different. We talked about the pottery and everything. It goes over the pottery that we were just talking about. It's going to keep on going a little more. But it has obviously some interesting finds that it has there. Let me just kind of point that out on here. Actually, I think I jumped past it right here. So very interesting things that it had. I'm just going to play something. Now, we had talked about this, right? Some of the changes in time, but I'm going to let it play, right? Because it's just talk about that group. Remember how I showed that they were there past about 16,000 and whatnot? Remember how I said the younger Dryas was about 12,000 years before present in their out of Africa scale? And that I believe has evidence of the wiping out of multiple peoples, as we see in the biblical narrative of a catastrophic flood. It affects every single person's around the world. And that's what this is starting from. It's starting from the younger Dryas. You can see that right there. And then talking about that they were there throughout the whole time, that this group will be there the whole time.
2000 and 2000 BC, when the local climate became more humid. The Jomon period was rich in tools and jewelry made from bone, stone, shell, and antler, pottery figurines, and vessels. And
all right, so that little pottery thing that you see there, so that little design, I'm going to read you something because they've had a little article doing a major study on these things, and they have obviously went over the genetics that we see there. It's very interesting. When we go over these things, you can see obviously what genetics they have there. Obviously, D groups, you can see from the fossils, right? So obviously a long time ago, said 6,000 years before present, we got D groups over there. And a lot of these reports are going to be from 2021. So a lot of these are recent, but we do get O groups there. But notice these ones are more recent, right? These ones are more recent than the D groups. So the D groups were there for a long time, and the O groups are recent. And remember, O comes from F. So O had to first get the mutation that 2 exists. So from F, again, going back to this little piece, right? Remember how F makes GHIJK, HIJK, IJK, and then from your K2, we got a note here at K2, you're going to get your NO, which makes your N and your O. So very important. So we got to note that K2 does make also P's that make Q and R's, but K2 also makes your N and O groups, which are going to be like your Chinese and whatnot. So we can get every single, like I said, we can get every single person in the world from just a few SNPs, especially that F-M89, which makes a large amount of people. So a lot of people are mutating coming from one grandfather, from one person. So F-M89 will be that mutation. F-M89 later brings that O. So we're going to take a look real fast at some of that connection there. So we're kind of seeing that everyone's spreading out and developing in certain areas, and a lot of them are becoming indigenous to the areas very early. So they're going to become one with the area that they live in. So that's going to be something that's fairly important to take note of. So fairly important to take note of as we go over these things. So again, we're going to be looking at the root movements here. All right. So again, looking at the fossils. So obviously O, they'll say that it was fairly earlier and everything. You got some of the obviously other D groups there. Here's a more O that came there. So we noticed that the oldest group that's there is D. So that's also fairly interesting. They go into more different information on this site. They go into other lineages. Obviously, we know what's in Mesolithic British and whatnot. We had looked at some of those things and whatnot. They go into Scandinavia, different little pieces, right? Himalayas. You can see in the Himalayas, obviously, you got some O's, but notice you got some D's there as well in the Himalayas. So just to show that right here. Let this thing open real fast. I think I meant to show Tibet. I'm going to show Tibet before I show this one, as that's where the D group is in Tibet. All right. There's definitely that. Yeah. I'll just put this down. So Tibet is basically by India, but here's where Himalayas. So you can see right there. So we know that the D group was in the area of the Himalayas. We know that because we also can find, as we see right there, we also can find the fossils in these areas. So you can see right there, Himalayas. It's about that same age. So very important. Get a good understanding on this. So you can kind of get an understanding. So why is it important? Because, you know, noting the replacement, noting which lineages replace whom kind of makes a picture here. Well, let me just go down here to something. I'll just quote it off of here. The arrival of this group, let me just quote it, copy it. This is that group that we were just talking about that has the O group. So this group of people, this group has the O group. So you can see right there, the Yayo. I don't know if you say how you say that. Yayo, probably that's how you say it, I don't know. But it has a O group. So remember that. That's going to be a group that comes in and replaces the D group. That's going to be very important to note. And notice that as we talk about that group, let me actually point it out here. Or I put that out weird. Or Ainu. I gotta think about how that's worded. Or is it even on this thing? Oh no, not Anu. The Jomon, which is right here. There's Anu. Ainu. Anu. But here you can see, obviously, when we're talking about the groups, we can see that was that group that obviously had pushed out the Aman group. But after that, we get the Anu group coming back in. So we get one group pushed out and another group pushed in. The Anu right here, which again, that's that group that has that C and that D group in it. That's why we was looking at that combination to look at that all those genetics there to get a good understanding there. So let's just talk about mtDNA. There's some mtDNA. Right. Obviously, it just talks about that it has connections with the Jomon people, obviously close relations to those of the Jomon and everything. Let me go to where is the Y DNA. I'm gonna put it right here. All right, so right there. Remember we were talking about that M50, the M dash or the D dash M55. So you can see genetic tests have shown that the Anu belong mainly to Y DNA D dash M55 and C groups. So you can see that's going to be the male group. So remember, the C group is older than the D group, but the D group is older than the O group, which comes in and takes its place. But it's still going to be there. So that's going to be very important. So just looking at this a little more. So we had talked about a little bit of this. You can see right here, the Japanese Jomon branch of Haplogroup D, D-M55, is in fact believed to have been isolated from other branches of D for about 50,000 years ago. So you can see what's going on. So it's very important to know that. That's why we know that it obviously was with the people of the Adamese island and those of the area of Tibetan. All right, I probably should show this little place because it has connections even to islands over here. So it has connections with islands down here. Right here. So you can see right there. So the D group obviously has connections with these groups over here. And remember, we're talking a lot of this is ancient evidence. So the D group obviously reaching all the way over these in these areas. So that's going to be very important for noting origins. So very, very important. Let me just read a highlight here. So again, the arrival of the Yomai, how you say that, people in Japan marked the end of the Jomon period. So you can see what's going on. And that was just relevantly recent for this group to be replaced by that group. And then the Ainu come in right after them. Their arrival used to be estimated at around 300 BC, but more recent, obviously, archaeological evidence suggests they may have arrived as early as 1000 BC. So they count 1000 BC early for the O group to go where the D group is at. So that's important. So it's let you know the D group is more older in that area. As it says, the Japanese Jomon branch of Haplogroup D or D-M55 is in fact believed to have been isolated from other branches of D about 50,000 years ago. So that's going to be obviously older than every D or every E group. Your D group is older than your E groups because nobody can show, right? I already asked this for E1B1A. E1B1A is not African because there is no Mesolithic, there is no Paleolithic, and there is no Neolithic. Barely, not even a Chalcolithic. There is none. No Bronze Age. There's no African E1B1A. The only time they come in is about transition of the Iron Age. That's the only time that they come in, but that's still really recent compared when you put it on the scale. So this is actually very, very important to know how old D is and where is D's origin and the fossils, right? And how we know that D is a separate group because it's separated by that isolation in the lands of Japan, right? Being separated in that little island. So very important. So that's why we was looking at these three groups. So D, so which one's older? C is older than D, right? And then O comes in. So that's very important. So that's going to be very important. Very, very important. All right. So O group comes in a little later and settle in that area. That's going to be important because it basically gives us an understanding of relationship, which ones were there by migration evidence and which one would be indigenous. So Ainu would be fairly indigenous, especially when we link them to the ancient Jomon ancestry. So that's going to be taking us all the way back to the original Japanese culture, which they say is about 14,000 to, they say three. Remember that replacement by the how you say that, Yomani, or how you say it, Yomai. I probably said that weird, but by that other group that we're just looking at, we know that this group that was there earlier, almost as old as the Natufian, right? Almost as old as the Natufian, was settled in the areas of Japan. So if you take the Natufian and you put them side by side with this group would be older than the Natufian. So this would be a very older group when you put them side by side. And what are the Natufian? You can see right here, the Natufian. When you put it next to that D group, that's Japanese. The Natufian settled in the areas of the Levant, and that will have an E group. We're also ancient set Indo-European female lineages. So you can see what's going on there. So they resettled in that upper area fairly early. That's important. So E groups of the Natufians about the same age after the Younger Dryas, as you can see here, they will be in the area of the Levant. So that's important. about the same age as the Japanese lineage of the Jomon people. So coming to the same, about the same ages, right? So it would obviously show their connection. And remember, we showed that their culture has that same pottery culture that they're named after, reaches all the way to Syria. So we can see that obviously that's where the Natufian culture was. It would make sense that if they did split around that area, that they would connect in the area of Syria, right? So that's going to be very important to kind of give a picture that if we have a lineage that divided in this area, some went over here and some went over here, if we make a cross section of that, even if we say that same lineage goes into Africa, it only leaves us with a middle cross section in the areas of the Middle East. That would mean that for the evidence of people diversifying had to begin in the area of the Middle East, that the people had to start in this area and diversify and fill these areas very early, leaving from upper areas here, following with other ancient lineages that would be around these areas, reaching out over here. And that's very important to take a note of, that this whole area will be filled by the same lineages that will be related, right? When I say the same lineages, obviously genetic atoms, lines, all are going to spread in this whole world. So that's important. They're going to all be related, but different, but they all link to this area over here, especially when we look at the D and E groups and how they divide. It gives us a very clear picture of where the people must have got off the ark and had filled the earth in this early time frame. So always remember, when we're looking at these years, they're obviously exaggerated, right? But still, using the exaggeration, we can see that the D and E group wouldn't necessarily be called African, but they would actually be something totally different. Most likely Asian is what we're seeing, is that it will be a Eurasian lineage rather. But let's keep on keeping on, because that's going to give clarity to some pieces of the pie, as we need to know. So that's going to be very important. So I already showed these and these other things, and we connected the pottery, right? We have put the pottery together, and we have found that the pottery that we were talking about reached all the way to those areas, right? That's going to be very important. It had to do with the Jomon culture, Now, there's no doubt there's obviously more in it, but I just want to make this a kind of short, kind of long message, just to give a good understanding on these out groups, because these are groups that I don't see a lot of people talk on. Your D groups and your O groups and your C groups and their origins, right? Which one's older, which one's this. I seen an individual go over D, obviously expressing how old it was, but he also went back and expressed how C was older. That was true, because we know C is a very older lineage than D. We also know that if we take the true origins of humans, we know that humans had began outside of Africa, right? We had talked about that before when we talk about the migration of modern humans, right? For example, the analysis identified a Eurasian Y DNA. Obviously, when it's talk about A00, that was followed by 3 separate, basically Homo sapiens sapien exoduses by A0, A, and A from Eurasia into Africa, with A0 signifying the earliest and A the most recent of these early exoduses. So your earliest exodus was that a lot of groups had went into Africa, right? We had talked about that. That was on a different video when we was talking about these things, right? We went over this little video. A lot of the information are coming out in 2001, and it's talking about some very interesting things. Let's just talk about how Homo sapiens actually might have an origin in Eurasia. Long story short. So let's summarize what we did today. So just to get a good understanding of what we was touching on, is we was touching on those D and those C groups, and then talk about how they got that connection with those O groups and everything. So that's kind of important to get a good understanding of the separation of these lines. So we got an understanding on the monophyletic families, right? It looks like a lot of lineages, right? But really, if we put them at their root nodes, the world was fairly empty at some point in time, besides the other subhumans like your Neanderthals and Denisovans, which haplogroups are A. For Neanderthal is A000 with 3 zeros, and Denisovan is A0000 with 4 zeros. Those lines were wiped out. We know because we were talking about, like I said, the Younger Dryas and the flood. Those lines are all wiped out. All ancient prehistoric humans who are not modern humans, whoever's not from Y chromosome Adam is not a modern human. And anyone who's not from Adam is going to be wiped out from the flood, right? And when I say Adam, I'm using the scientific term, right? The scientific Y chromosome Adam, right? Anyone from the Y chromosome Adam from the modern human group, that group is going to be the group that's surviving today. That's very important. So we got a good understanding of the mutations of those things, just to see these things in a complete picture. Just to see these things in a complete picture. So that was the focus of today, is that we want to also make it clear that the DE group apparently split in the area of the Middle East. And a lot of the D group has settled in areas of Japan. We're talking Paleolithic time frame, right? Everything that I was a lot of things I was showing you today was Paleolithic time frame going on to our time frame, to modern time frame, and that we still see these groups there in the modern time. And so ancient time to modern time, it all makes sense. So, and then obviously the pottery shows the same movements that we had seen with obviously the peoples, that the pottery, the movement of the pottery moves to places that we expect to find these lineages, from Syria all the way to Japan. So we see these lineages from Syria all the way to Japan to see a connection that's fairly important. So this is an ancient native Japanese lineage. That's what this was. That was replaced. That was important. That was replaced from its area fairly recently. But it will be an ancient Japanese lineage. That's what makes it important. That is an ancient Japanese lineage. That's what we was looking at today. So we can get a good understanding on where they have settled. So they settled in a lot of different places, obviously in areas of Japan. So this has a lot of different information on it, on these different groups and everything. Very important when we take a look at them to what we see. And it has those obviously those genetic historical informations to give us a good understanding of it. We know that obviously the Jomon is one group of people, but they're going to be obviously different than the one that migrates and comes in. So the Chinese group that comes in, or other Asian groups that come in, that they have different lineages, and they're more recent than the one that was there for a long time. Right? When it talks about ancient lineages that were there, the Jomon period that was there about the time of the Natufian time frame, all the way to modern times. That's what we're seeing there. So that would just be in connection of an ancient line that, in consideration with even the Ainu, which are indigenous to Japan, basically makes the totality of this lineage to be Japanese, to be Asian. So that's an important piece to understand. This one I'm going to close. We don't need nothing from that. That's just, I was going to go into some information of C, how old C is. C is very old, but we don't need that right now. We just know that C is older because we looked at that on the total of the map. We noticed that C was actually an older line. So very important stuff. Just for a interesting summary today. It may be a little different than other things, but D is a Shemite. D group is a Shemite. That what you just saw there was a Syrian going to Japan. That's what you just saw today. Is that the split from the Natufian E groups, the Syrian D group actually went to Japan, went to areas of Japan. So that's going to be very important. I talked about that before with the connections with Lud and Elam for the D1 and D2, that these have connections to certain lines that apparently has started in the Levant, and had quickly and speedily went to Japan. So very, very important to note that we do see this group as a Japanese group and as a Semitic group that goes to Japan very early on and settles there. So very, very, very important. So making sure I have everything here. So just doing some light work today, as we always like to bring out, different interesting elements of things. So as always, it's just about truth, finding things concerning truth, and putting the pieces together so that we can take a look at it and consider, as always, it's like a grain of salt, but a little salt is a little salt, but a lot of salt is a lot of salt. So very important. I'm just going to show this one more time. So again, remember, CT makes your DE groups. So CT, a long time ago, it was in the lands of Jordan and everything. So again, Syria, because Damascus, that's where the Shemites were, in the area of Damascus, and they split from there. And you see right here, the DE split in the area of Damascus, Syria, and then you can see they go to the areas of China and Mongolia and Japan. They go very far, right, moving out different areas and the lands and whatnot. And you can see the mtDNA is there, right? You can see what mtDNA they have. Some very interesting mtDNA, I think. So you can see what they have there. It's a lot of them that's under N's and M's for the D group. For the D group, that is. So you can see on the full chart, right? We can see where these groups go, right? These are some ancient lineages that go on these different areas and everything. So that's something that is important to take note of. But the D group right here, it began over here, split, went up here, went over here. It doesn't rule in this area, so it only lasts a little bit, but mainly where it goes early on is it shoots this way, right? Through areas of Mongolia, right? We can see it settles in certain areas over here. We see different subgroups, but it settles here first because this is one of the most isolated areas right here. Very early on, this D group settles there. So D-M55. So D1, D2, we know D1 is super Japanese. So very Japanese that D1 is. So you can see right there, the earliest one, that's right there. That's the one I was pointing at. So to get a good understanding on some of the early splits of this line, besides the area where it's split at, which is right here. So the area where it's split at right there. So very, very important stuff, I think. Very, very important stuff just to take note of. All right. So that's all I got for today. I just wanted to make that clear that when we're looking at these fossils, if we link who they are and everything, it's going to make a big picture for generations to come, for clarification, to know where people began, where people started, where they end up, the actual fossils, right? The actual conclusion of the actual fossils, not media, but actual fossils. Now, if anyone got any questions, right? And remember, Japan, when we talk about proto channels and stuff, always remember that when you're looking at fossils and stuff, look at what the time looked like at that time, what the land looked like, because it's going to kind of give a good picture. So obviously, this is not what it looked like long ago. It was all connected. We talked about that already. All this land was highly connected. And that was during the time when that isolation happened. So this whole piece was one, then the water rose, and made this island, separated this little area, island, plateau. We got a good understanding on the separation of lineages that are here and around these areas. And the first group that was here was C, then the major group there was D, the D group. And then the O group came there. But we obviously would have other SNPs there, other groups. But we got a good understanding. DE is Shem, A and B is Helm, and CF will be the lines of Japheth. All right. So if any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's what we had today, is that we've seen a migration of the DE groups, especially D, that left its cord impressed pottery in the lands of Syria and went all the way with its cord marked pottery all the way to Japan and had settled in areas as far as Japan and became a native group in the land of Japan and basically ruled there for a long time in the land in areas of Japan. And that's where that name Jomon come from. That name, as the same age of the Natufian, this is a D group. This group settles in the lands of Japan extremely early. So with that family, the out of Africa concept is not lasting. The Eurasian concept is starting to build some very important understandings when we actually take the whole picture of the map of these lineages. So if you take this and you layer it over its brother lineage E, you can get a good understanding of where it splits. Let's put it a middle point again. Where does it split? Even though we already got the answer from geneticists when they tell us themselves about where it splits. They tell us right here that the Middle Eastern haplogroups D and E split, which remember, we found out that D was actually Syrian for its total understanding, for a total understanding of it. But let me go back over here, or rather here, and point this out. Right here. I don't know why I was clicking on that, but let me grab this map. So now note over here, where's this group? So your DE group, notice the largest portion is in Arabia. So if D was larger over here and E is larger over here, if we make a midpoint with this one and this one, it'll be about this area. So about Mesopotamia. So I would say that D and E, based on the fossils, is Mesopotamian. So D and E is actually Mesopotamian. That would mean your Sumerians, your Syrians, different things like that. That D and E would have early roots to those lines. They would have early links to those groups. And we know that because Natufian clouds this area. And we know this Jomon clouds this area. So that early split had to split from this area. So that's important to understand. Very, very important to get a good understanding of it. All right, so that's the family of D and E. That D is actually older than E. We can even see that D is older. Right here, you'll see that it'll put that D, you can see right here, close to about the same age. They'll say that this one's older, but not really, not so. This one's actually much older because like we said, we have papers that would tell you right here, they'll say only fit this one. Look like they might need to update that because even when we put our marker there, you can see a good idea that they say formed about the same time. So that's important to understand. But then they'll say this one must be smaller. But again, that's why looking at actual independent papers makes a good understanding on those things to get a full understanding. That we know that we see that DE obviously split. But again, we can see that the early Ds had evidence of being about 53,000 years ago. So if you take that 53,000 and put it even close to that, that's 52. This will be 53. This will be older. So D would be actually older than E. So that's very important to note. Very, very important to note. And you can see, just to show that was from this little paper that we know that's older. We already talked about it as well, but Y chromosomal sequences of the versages of Indian populations and the ancestry of the Adamese. So just getting a breakdown of those lineages. And that was that lineage that we was talking about, that the split from the areas of India. So we had talked about that before, that settled in this little island over here, these little islands, which are right over here, that we were highlighting before, the Adamese Islands. So right over there. Just to show that. So you can see right there. So and that was it. Again, that was the Shemite D group. That was the Shemitic D group that we see, the Jarwal and the Ongich, how you say that? Ongich, Ogi, probably shared the haplogroup D lineage with each other within the last 7,000 years. but had diverse, obviously, from the Japanese. Remember the isolated Japanese lineage. Haplogroup D, Y chromosome said 53,000 years ago, most likely by a split from a shared ancestral population. So obviously we see that the D group, again, it began in the area. We can see even one more piece connecting that 53,000 years, like we said with the Ainu. We went over that with some other pieces, but we can see right here that the Japanese branch of DM55 was distant and isolated from other D branches more than 53,000 years ago. So D is an older branch than E. So that would make, by default, the DE groups Asian. So that's important to know concerning roots of that lineage. So very, very important to know when connecting pottery back to its origin and connecting genetics back to its origin, back to its foundation. So that was a short little note there, but we have broke down the roots, the monophyletic families, and the families itself. So with that, the D group and other groups, origin may surprise you where they actually might have started out at. So it might surprise where they actually might have began. So I don't believe the out of Africa concept because it's not showing enough proof. And many other geneticists are starting to conclude that as well. So with that family, I just want to show you the family of the Shemites, the D and E group, that the D group is older and goes into areas of Japan more sooner and settles in places more spread in areas of Asia. So with that, that's all I got for you. With that, if you got any questions, throw them out now so we can touch on those. Not found. That's a good question. Right there, I'm guessing connecting to that. Let's touch on that real fast. What tribe is D0 from Nigeria? Let's go. Let's take a quick look at that. So now that was an interesting little study. In fact, we can just go to it right here. So D0 is actually D2. So D0 is actually D2. Let's take a quick look at it real fast. All right, so remember DE splits and you get your E groups, which is your E-M96, which remember we had talked about that lineage is going to be Eurasian. For example, from this paper here, you can see here about the split, Saudi Arabian Y chromosome diversity and its relationship with nearby regions that we were talking about. And we can see what it talks about, the presence of the two underived E-M96 Saudi Arabian lineages, because we know E began in Saudi Arabia. That's why most of the E groups are Saudi Arabian. That's why a lot of times if you notice with E1B1B, a lot of geneticists would conclude E1B1B is Arabian. So that's important. That makes other E groups also Arabian because E1B1B is one of the oldest ones. Not the oldest, but one of the oldest. So very important. And we just know that it just tells us that basically CFP143 and DE-YAT evolved nearby, but outside Africa. So they evolved nearby each other, your CF and your DE, but outside of Africa. They developed outside of Africa. Because if you read the biblical narrative, Ham, Shem, and Japheth was around Noah, at least to the third generation, right? With Cain and other lines. So they were around each other for a long time. But let's keep on keeping on just to get a good understanding on that just for this piece. So let's look at those groups. So we can see, obviously, if we look at D2, they'll say this is what they try to do. They say D2 had settled in this area and this area. Now, we don't have a root D to say that D started over here, but rather the D group shows evidence of coming downwards if it did come into here. And that's what we're going to look at, the Nigerian ones real fast. So you can see right here, the Nigerian ones. Let's go to this over here. So Remember, DE makes your E, and it also makes your D groups. So it also makes your D groups. So here's your D, your D before you get your D1 and D2. So you can see right there, that's going to be D1. And then D2 is going to be the one that we're speaking of. Now, the problem with D2, I don't know why, but they don't have information on the page for it. A page doesn't exist. But we can go into D2 because when they had brought out D0, it's actually known that D0 has been named D2, right? That's important. So D0 is actually D2. So there was a time that they were trying to argue D2 as being African, but we know that that didn't work anymore because obviously some of the fossils that they found that actually found that lineage within Eurasia, that's actually important. But let me go down to D2. Here it is. I'll show you who's related to D2. So here's the Nigerians that you want to see. And the Nigerians, obviously, when you're looking at the papers, that this paper from 2019 is obsolete to conclude that because of D0, which is D2, is African, to try to make all other branches African. As you can see right here, it is a mutation of a mutation that wouldn't work, besides the fact that it's found in Americas and in obviously areas of Saudi Arabia and, you know, other pinpoints of areas of Syria. So D2 actually would be that the Syrian branch. That's what we was also looking at when we was connecting that coordinate where that actually came from the lands of Syria. That D2 that D2 that went down into the areas of Africa that left from Syria actually would be that Shemitic lineage. So that's why we was looking at that when we was going over that D2 would be that line that went down into that area, which would again be that D group that also is found outside of Africa. And more larger portions is found outside of Africa than in Africa. Even to know who's the earlier lines in Africa, I just want to point out something real fast. I'm gonna point out a quick source on which groups are native African. And we know because by studying Egypt, right? Because there's only a few ways to go into Africa, only a few ways to go into Africa. And the areas of Egypt have some of the earliest lineages. So let me point something out here. Which ones the earlier ones in Africa and which ones are not. I'm gonna show you from an interesting little study right here. All right, so this is a study that's studying one of these ancient areas of Upper Nubia and everything, close in the area of Levant, close to Nubia, whatnot. But this is what they found out when they're talking about some of these areas and whatnot. There's a lot of different studies on this that breaks this down, right? That goes over these things. But let me just read you what it says. The researchers observed that the Neolithic Huerta-Sánchez, probably sounds weird, but that's the place. Huerta-Sánchez, or how you say that? Huerta-Sánchez. It says samples generally belong to different parental, that's your Y DNA, parental lineages, then the later Mesoretic or post-Mesoretic and Christian period samples, right? If you ever seen that, it just shows a whole spread of different lineages during the Christian time frame of the Nubian fossils, right? But going on, most of the basically individuals were the ancient individuals were AM13. So the older individuals, the original individuals that were there would have AM13 bearers, right? Because we talked about that. A group is the Hamites, whereas the Mesoretic or post-Mesoretic and Christian era samples were instead mainly haplogroups DE, haplogroup YAP, which includes D-M174 and E-M96 clades, and haplogroups F carriers. So F carriers are like your R groups, your G groups, your I groups, or like J groups that's there. So those are always going to come from your F. Remember, we talked about the F carriers, right? To its foundation, F carriers are from your F-M89. So F carriers is what it's talking about there. There's sons of the F group. That's kind of important. So back over here, or right over here. So again, so who was first in the lands of Africa? We know that A groups were there first, and then your DE and your F groups come there a little later. So original Hamites would be the ones who had settled in the land of Ham. The land of Ham is of the A and B groups. That's going to be very important. But then it is replaced by some of the CT sons, which is D and E and CF. So that's important to get a good understanding of that. So who would be this group? Most likely the ones that are these ones, the Syrians, that group, because that's what we were connecting today, is that they started in the lands of Syria, but they went to the lands of Japan. So that would be the Jomon people, right? It has a genetic connection to that group because they're both D groups, right? Just a different SNP. That's all that it is. A different SNP, but it's still going to be D groups. So they're going to be from DE. So that's important. But the area that it links to is Syria. That's what it links to. So you're going to have a group that's leaving from Syria with that D0 of that group. Would be a Shemite. That's what it would be. It'd be a Shemite. Let's see. That's a good question. What does CT mean in old culture as a Y chromosome? Okay, yep. That's a good question. So usually when you see CT, like for example, even this one, because we can see that, for example, in some E groups, sometimes you'll see CT, and that CT just because it's a group. When you see these groups with these, first you'll see a letter or letter number and whatnot. Sometimes you'll see a number right at the letters. That just means that it's going to be a head group that makes many other groups. It's going to be a group from a group, right? Long story short is that you have things like, for example, F-M89. You got F-M89. That's going to be important because that's going to be a SNP. It's not F1, not F2, not F3. It's F-M89. So sometimes these SNPs that come afterwards just expresses if it's like a head group, like like this CT. Like for example, if you go back to DE, you'll see a CT right here. So sometimes you'll see that because CT just means it's making a lot of lineages under it. But sometimes you'll see like under this E group, sometimes you'll see SNPs like that. You'll see SNPs like that. But it would be like what you're seeing is probably a SNP under a SNP under a SNP. So it's just basically more SNPs deeper under. But if you just find its original node or its parent lineage, like for example, this SNP here, let me just see if I can just put it down. ECTS1. Let me just put it down real fast. Make sure I put it down right. 21-4. All right. Let's kind of put it down so that we can look at this, or we'll put Y tree. Because I'm not 100% familiar with this exact SNP. Let me see if I'm putting that right. Are we talking about an E group? Is this an E? So I'm not. I myself, I know a lot of E SNPs. I'm not familiar with this one. I don't think I can find it. You know, that's not it. I gotta think how it would be put. Let me just copy it. I'll try it one more time. But pretty much, that's pretty much what it is. It's a SNP of a SNP of a SNP. Long story short, is that it would be a SNP of a SNP of a SNP. And like just to kind of, I'll use this one for example. How to find the ultimate node. So you see what you see right here. Let's say you don't know what it is, right? Let's say you want to find out if this is E1B1A or E1B1B. This is all you got to do. If you notice, it has a bunch of tabs. Look for Y tree, Y full, and put the exact SNP, and then go to the tabs all the way back until one looks familiar. If you're not familiar, just go to original E. If you notice something, if you notice on E, there's going to be other SNPs of these E's. Now, if you're not familiar with these E's, it gets a little hard. But if you're familiar with these E's, the main ones you want to know is M2 and this one M215. If you just know M215 or E-M35, that's actually E1B1B. Or you can just easily just click it, one of these ones, right? And it'll show you, right? It'll take you right over here, and you can see, right? If you go to the information, if you're not familiar with it, and you can go to, let's go to something to make it easy. Let's see, because these just make it hard. So that's just SNPs. So you can see right here, CT, that's just SNPs that underneath it, you're going to have different lines underneath it. So just kind of make it simple on there. That's just SNPs that going to have groups underneath it. That's all you pretty much see in there. But that's what you need to know if you want to find these groups or what their origin is just knowing what these are, these little SNPs. But this is E1B1B. All these SNPs is E1B1B. But for yours, I did not see that one. But that's how it is sometimes. If you want to just find out what it is, throw it on Y tree. I actually never seen this one. This exact SNP. But I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to find. I'm sure it's Y-DNA. But it might have a little, what's the word I'm looking for? Might be a little hard to find it if it's like that. If it's kind of hard like that. But that's something that's important to know when we're going over, this information. Is that if you want to find the exact SNP, you just got to know those main words, those main what's the word I'm looking for? Those main letters. Sometimes those first letters for E1B1B and E1B1A for those things. If you're trying to find that understanding of that SNP, if that's that question. Otherwise, you want to know exactly what it is. What tribes are connected? That's a good question. That one looks a little more familiar. Let's see. I'm guessing, is that an E or a D? Probably E. Let's put that down. I think about how it is. CTS. And they usually use that CTS on their thing. 9160. Probably put that weird. 9160, unless I said that wrong in my head. 9160. E. Amen. Let's see. Y tree. All right, so this one, I'm thinking this one had to put it all weird. I don't think this is it. This one right here. I don't think it's this combination. If you can make sure that's the right combination, 9106. Am I putting that weird? No, that's 9106. Okay, I just typed it weird. I put 9160. It's 9106. Yeah, that one is Saudi Arabian. That one actually is a Saudi Arabian lineage. This one would be E1B1A. We know because if you notice, E1B1B and E1B1A always have these two SNPs from your E1B1 P2, and then E1B1A has a V38 and then M2. So this is going to be a SNP all the way down from this line, but it's going to be from M2. That's what it's going to be from. It's going to be from M2, and it will be from Saudi Arabia. We can get a good understanding of his map here. And you can see that it also has high connections in the lands of, as you can see, in the lands of Britain. So Great Britain and the United Kingdom and some areas of Ireland, you have that sub-SNP mainly there. So it could be through a certain dispersia that went into areas of Iran. So that is very interesting. It doesn't have a lot of connections to these areas, but it does have some connections to what it looks like is the Chadic area. So there's some Chads in this area and some of the area over here, which we know a lot of Jotanites were over here. So this is actually a Shemitic area. Later on, we get in the areas of Abyssinia. And remember I said that when we looked at the sources, Abyssinia is a Shemitic area. So, and then obviously high portions in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and areas of Iran, and probably most likely connections with Syria, no doubt. So that's something that is important. Obviously, this group will be one of those groups taken to America and areas of Alaska. So it has connections with mainly the United Kingdom. That's really interesting. So this E1B1A is mainly in the areas of the United Kingdom. So they would be a dispersed group. That'll be a subsnip that would have went most likely getting some connections of being taken and being put all the way over here. So that's really interesting because just to have that high portion up there kind of makes an interesting impression. It makes an interesting impression, I believe. So obviously it has a lot of connections to Yemen and Saudi Arabia and everything. But Saudi Arabia is one of its earlier lineages that you're going to have there. So its earliest lineages, obviously going in areas of Kenya and Saudi Arabia, but that's a good connection there. That's a really good connection when you're connecting in that lower area of the Levant and areas of Africa, because that's going to show us dispersal evidence of dispersals, especially that weird large group in the areas of Ireland and Britain. So that is really interesting. That kind of makes you like want to look into why did they get into the area. In fact, I most likely already know there's a major dispersal of people being dispersed into the areas of Ireland and lands of Britain during the slave trade. And we know that slave trade happened to those who historically documented, you can find it, were the Jews. So that's very important to understand on that. So very interesting. I think it's a very interesting subsnip. Very, very interesting. So it would be most likely connections to, it could be as early as the lineages of San Tome. So that's something that's very important. Or the lineage of Spain that went up there. That's something that's very important. Your advice, amen. Is that's right. You want to be 1A. That's absolutely right. Amen, amen. Nice, you found it. Okay, that one is most likely what it is. Let's look at that one. E-CTS and 112004. Oh, there it is. All right, so now this one's going to be an E1B1A. It's going to be younger than the one that we just were looking at, or in a sense older, because it is fairly older, but these years are what I say, what's the word I'm looking for? Subjective. But we can get a good understanding of it right here. This is going to be a very early lineage. You can see it went into some of the areas of Mexico, Senegal, and that's where a lot of Jews went to Senegal. That's important. So obviously into certain areas, I'm going to go back a snip just to kind of find out where its snips come from. You got some areas of Egypt. We got sources that say most of the Jews were in the areas of Egypt. Go back another snip. Spain, this is most likely the Jews of San Tome. So we obviously got a good connection of an ancient snip that's connected to Spain. That's going to be good to know. Go back another snip. Go back a little more we can like get a picture here. Because we know, even just going to like, let's go to the origin snip. If you just go to M2, right? M2 is such a spread out branch. It's such a branch that's highly spread out. But M2 began in Saudi Arabia. That's important. M2's branch based on the fossils and based on, you know, modern people and looking at the SNPs and everything, it began in Saudi Arabia, just to get a good understanding of that. So this one, I don't know why we don't have a little picture to kind of demonstrate it, but that's what it is. It's a lineage. That lineage is obviously has connections to the ones of San Tome and Arabia, different ones around the area that goes into areas of Africa. Because you got to know also the history of how they were settling the Jews in Guinea, how they were moving the Jews in Guinea and Angola. So they were settling those people all in those areas. So that definitely makes perfect sense. So that's a really interesting snip as well. It's definitely an interesting snip. I'm glad that we got to fix it and look at it to get a good understanding on that one. So that's very nice, very, very nice. So scattered in all nations, right? Your backstory might have an interesting story when you start looking at those snips and start looking at, you know, the backstory behind origins of these Shemitic lineages. So remember, D and E are Shemitic, and the fossils show that they were outside of Africa before they were inside of Africa, right? So that's going to be very important when looking at the totality of the picture, the complete picture, not just a small picture, but the full picture of these things to get a good understanding of the origin. That they have split from here. You get your D and E's. Every red dot that you see here is an E. So you get your D and E's that spread throughout all these areas, and you get your obviously your D groups that spread and go in these areas. So D and E split in the Middle East. It's going to be very important, as we had went over before, that D and E split in the Middle East. So very important. So with that, family, that's all I got for you for now. I'll put some of these notes in the description. This is the first one will be this one on Asia, where we went over D on the Asian build. Maybe we'll build on more on it, but really that's all we need because we got the whole understanding of the picture. We know, this is what we know, that we have the corded marked pottery connected to the corded or cord impressed pottery of Syria. And we know that the skeletons and the genetics show that the D group is indigenous. It shows that it was there almost as old as the Natufian, if not older, most likely older. And we know that this lineage would be connected to Japanese lineages, having connection to other ancient Y chromosomes that would be in that area, like C's and O's. It has a historical tie after being replaced by some of the old lineages, but it was a dominant lineage in that area for a long time, isolated. And we know that it would be that D group. So, and we know that it has evidence of being there in the Outer Africa scale 50,000 years ago plus. So that's something that's very important. But we know that the D and E split a long time ago. So that's very important, just to draw something so that we can have this with one more mental understanding, right? Let's say we had a DE group. Let's say we had a, make this bigger. Let's say we had a DE group. You can constantly keep making D groups for a long time, and it can still be making DE for a long time. So it can be producing D groups and DE groups for a long time, and most likely till about 55,000 years ago, based on the Outer Africa scale, you'll get your DE still with some different D groups. You'll have your D1 and you'll have some D2s around, which is D0. So D2 is actually D0. D2 is D0. And then you still get your DEs. And then about 42,000 years ago, you'll get a split. And then you'll get your E-M96. And then you'll get your continuation of D1s and D2s. You see how that can work? So you can start off with a DE, still continuing on with the older D groups and still getting more mutations of your DE groups, because we know that D has a separation of one lineage about 50,000 years ago. You'll still have your DE groups because we don't have any evidence of E being that old yet. when we have evidence of D1 and D2, especially D1 being about 50,000 years ago. And then we get a separation of an understanding that the D and E groups separated 42,000 years ago. And then you obviously will have more of your groups until about, I would say about 39,000 years ago. About that time, you'll start getting your splits of your E1s and your E2s and E1s and whatnot, your E1 groups, right? Because that's also what we see right here, that we know that the Natufian, when put on the Outer Africa scale, again, they obviously boost in age. As when you take the fossils and you put them on Outer Africa scale, that boosts them in age. That's the kind of point that's out right here. So right here, this was in 2021. It says the haplogroup common in Natufian E1B1B is also frequent in our database, with most of the pretty much ages about 8,000 to 7,000 or 9,000 years ago. Though we found a rare deep divergent Y chromosome, which basically is 39 KYA. So there it is right there. 39,000 years ago in the Natufian culture, you get your mutations there. So that's going to be based on the scientific scale. So again, who's doing this based on the scientific scale. So that's what you can see. DE will be older. You'll have D groups that will break from DE. They continue on from DE. 50,000 years ago, you got a separation of D1 and D2. These are going to be separate. DE continues on, and then you get a split from about 42,000 years ago. You get E separated from your D1 groups and your D groups and your D1 and D2. Pretty much these lineages separate. D and E splits 42,000 years ago. Right. That's genetic. All that was genetic facts. That's genetic facts that we're looking at. So again, one more time. There it is. Haplogroup D and E split 42,000 years ago. So very, very important that we was looking at that. So connecting that with the Natufian evidence that we just talked about. We just pointed out the genomic history of the Middle East. That was from 2021 about the Natufian from the Middle East. So very, very important. So that's how that would go. That's how that mutation would go. That mutation begins with a DE. You get your D, you get your D1 and D2 after a certain time frame, and then you get your split of E groups from your D. Then you're going to get your E1s and E2s a little later on. So very, very important. Close that, or close like that. All right, so now with that, family, I hope that this gives a little slight edification of truth when understanding the Shemitic family. So DE is going to be the sons of Shem, A and B, sons of Ham, CF makes the sons of Japheth. So very important to understand those monophyletic families, how they are collected from one node. So with that, let's see, D4N1A. Yes, that's the one we were just talking about, where we remember we had pointed that out, that yes, D2 is actually going to be the same as D0. But D4N1A, if you want to find the exact subsnit, we can do that real fast. D4 is definitely on topic, right? We'll go find this D4N1A. D4N1A. Now, are you talking about mtDNA? Because that is most likely mtDNA. That's what I'm thinking. So that is important to know if it's a mtDNA or a Y-DNA. D4, there is no D4 in Y-DNA, so this is most likely mtDNA. D4N1A. N1A. So yeah, this is Japanese. But that is going to be a mtDNA. So your female, your mother DNA. So mother DNA, D4N1E would be Japanese. So yes, that would be a Japanese lineage. Just to kind of make that clear. But remember, that's going to be your mtDNA. If you want to look at Y DNA, that's going to be only D1 and D2 for Y DNA of D. But D4 is gonna obviously it's gonna point to mtDNA just for that. Yep, that's right, mtDNA. That's right. It's it's Japanese. It's a Japanese lineage. That is a Japanese lineage. That's right. And that's what's interesting about that. Again, looking at the Ainu, since we were talking about that D lineage, the mtDNA definitely does have some of these lineages that when we talk about mtDNA, it does have some of these lineages that we have in other lines. So we can see right here, it most likely would come from this area where the D5 is. There's D4. So D4 and D5 definitely will come from this area and will become parts with those Japanese lineages that has settled in those areas. So you can see a nice portion of D4, 33%, 33% in the Ainu. Got a large portion of that group that was settled in that area, a very large portion. But remember, that's female, that's mtDNA. So it could be from the mother, or it could be that you would be a female. So that is going to be important also to know that it will be from the female. But it is a large portion, but it's larger. It's not as large in the D group, in the Jomon, but it's larger in the new coming group that comes in. It's large in Japanese groups, but it's larger in the Yomai. How do you say that? Yomai. That group is gonna have that larger D4, but the ancient groups didn't have a larger D4. They had a larger N9B, but and a larger M, but not D4 as large as the ones that come in a little later. So that's kind of important to know. So D4 would be a Japanese branch. It would be a branch that started about this area and migrated into these areas. So it would be a Japanese branch, just to kind of make it understood that isn't all these lineages, but larger in the new coming one. So D4 on there, just to kind of make that a little clear on there, since we're touching on D4. This one just shows, like, generations, the group and the time and everything. So obviously, which one's older? Obviously, the Jomon are the older groups. Ainu and Jomon are related. So Ainu and Jomon are related. These two groups are related. And you can see the difference in the mtDNA. That's got a larger N1B. Still got your D4 there, but then this one that comes in doesn't have as large of a D4, but the Ainu has a little bit of the D4 and still has a little bit of that. So fairly mixed, but that is going to be that Japanese branch that reaches over there. So that will be that group that settles over here, that D4 that we were just looking at over here, or over here, that we was looking at in the mtDNA, that D4. But that's a interesting haplogroup. Definitely on time. I think it's on time and on point. So yes. Technically, that D4 wouldn't be connected to that Nigerian lineage, because again, that D4 would be connected to the coming group that would have the O group. So it would have that O group instead, that have a larger of that D4. It wouldn't be more connected to the D of the Y DNA, but connected to the O of the Y DNA, more or less. But still obviously having connections with the early lineages. A small portion, but not as large as later. But amen, that was a good insight. So the Japanese Far Asian lineages, not a lot of people touch on these. So I wanted to take the time to touch on the roots and touch on the ancient lineages of these lines to kind of get a good picture of what we're seeing here when we're touching on these things. And these will be in the description if you want to go more into it. As always, as the week goes on, if I find any more information, I'll throw it on this note, as this is going to be mainly about D. This group, this note will be mainly about D. But as always, monophyletic families connect them to their roots to show who they are. That's why we was doing that when looking at the whole family, that we were realizing that the D groups, as the other groups, as we see right there, from your DE-YAP, you get obviously your split of your E and your D groups. So very important on that. But you got to be careful on those ages because D is actually showing itself to be older than other groups. So D shows itself to be a fairly older lineage than other groups. So very, very important. So E obviously is Levantan. D is Asian. This is going to be the Shemitic lineages that spread from the areas of Syria, Damascus. Their pottery matches, everything aligns. So major spread of that lineage that developed over here. All right. So with that, family, this is going to be the understanding of the DE Shemitic lines and that the evidence of this group, if we can establish that this group is not native to Africa, imagine what we can start doing with some of the other groups. If we can start looking at the fossils, we can paint the picture of the early spreads of the early sons of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So a lot of this, what I was showing you was before the settlement of Israel and Abraham and all that. So this was like ancient origins. So we just seen ancient origins to get a good understanding of these things and whatnot. All right. And we'll leave it like that. Just make sure I don't have nothing else to show. This one just goes over where we talking about some things with DE. Again, that can be some information that when you take carefully, you can find out detailedly of his origins and his roots. Also, D apparently might have some autosomal connections to like ancient Denisovans and stuff like that. So it might have some high connections to that. We talked about that before, that D might have some ancient autosomal connections to that line, which being about 55,000 said stretched years, it would make sense to see. It would make perfect sense. So this is what we did. We made sense out of this kind of mess that you see here. So it just talks about a northern route that you got your C groups, which are your earlier groups. But remember, your N and O are related. So N and O are related. So O becomes your Chinese groups. You got some N groups that come there. Your O groups are your Chinese groups. And then you get, obviously, your D groups. So coming from that area, your D groups. You're going to have a lot of your D groups that settle in these areas and these areas. So we're going to have a lot of D groups. And then, so C is older. So C group is there and D group is there. And then your O groups come in after. So who's first? C is first, then is D, then O comes in. So very important for that summary. But the rest is other sons of F. So remember, F makes your Q's and your O's and N's. All those are all related to F-M89. And your R1s and RBs, those all from F-M89. From GHIJK, HIJK, IJK. So that's what we did today to make sense of this movement. Who was first, who was second, who was third, and which ones are native. So we can see that these are ancient origin lineages that would be settled there. So just to make that make sense. So with that, family, that's all I got for you for now. You can watch it again just to get a full understanding of it, so you can understand the diversity of D and E versus A and B. So remember, DE is a Yap lineage, very, very separate from your African lineages, and obviously from your CF lineages, which go in the same places, but are going to be related differently to their monophyletic family, to their root. So CF is Japheth, DE is Shem, and your lines of A and B are going to be your Hamitic lines. So with that, family, be blessed, be beloved, and amen.